Okay, here we go. Is this as full screen as it gets then? Okay, great. So we'll get started. I'd like to share with you some results that we're working on from the LAMP instrument on LRO, looking at the lunar dayside and looking at the variation far UV signatures across the moon. Okay, so LAMP is the Lyman Alpha Mapping Project. It's on LRO, and it is a multi-purpose instrument because you may have heard Kurt Rutherford talking about exosphere data that LAMP measures and studies. LAMP also looks in the polar regions and uses stellar illumination and interplanetary hydrogen as an illumination source to be able to see inside the permanently shadowed regions. What I've been focusing on is the day side, so looking at solar light reflected off the surface back to the instrument and studying the lunar reflectance on the day side. So what we know about the lunar surface in the UV is that and hopefully you can see these spectra here. These are some sample reflectance spectra from 130 to about 200 nanometers. And we're looking at a few different sort of type examples of a Mare region, a highlands region, and a bright ray crater, because we know that the UV is a good region to look for weathering effects. And nearly everywhere on the moon, the spectral shape in the UV is kind of bluish, and that is the result of weathering, because in general the nanophase iron will tend to produce a bluish spectrum in the UV. And so we find that less weathered regions are more reddish in the UV. And then for composition, the presence of more opaques in Mare regions makes Mare regions in general even more blue than highlands regions. And then we also know that we have a strong water absorption at about 165 nanometers. And so we can look not only for water in the permanently shadowed regions, but for hydration on the day side using the presence of this strong absorption, which unfortunately I don't think you can see it in these graphics here, but can you see a little bit? Okay. So the idea is that the water absorption is so strong that you only need a little bit of it to change the slope significantly over a very confined region here. So what we have done is we have measured reflectance spectra all over the moon, and then what we'll do is we'll determine the slope just over this water absorption edge and see if it changes. And we find that it does, and I'll show you that in a sec. But then we also measure the slope at longer wavelengths away from the water absorption, so it shouldn't be affected by water at all. And we find that this is a region that's very sensitive to composition and also weathering effects. And this is at the longer wavelengths out here. So some of the results from measuring slopes over the water absorption edge are shown here. And this is where we find that the slope varies with time of day, essentially, suggesting that there is a variation in hydration across the surface with redder slopes, suggesting less water, bluer slopes suggesting less water in the midday, and redder slopes suggesting more water early in the day and late in the day. Now, when we look at the longer wavelengths that should be independent of water completely and more sensitive to composition and weathering, we see no diurnal variation. So it's just a jumble of slopes with time of day, as you might expect if it was composition. Okay, so that was previous results. And now what we're starting to do is look at composition over specific regions by focusing more on that long wavelength spectral slope. So we want to use that long wave spectral slope to study compositional variations and weathering effects. And what we're really digging into is looking at swirls and mature versus immature regions, and also other interesting regions like the Compton-Belkovich region. And that's what we're going to focus on in this talk here. And so I'm measuring the spectral slope over many reflectance spectra in the Compton-Belkovich region at these longer wavelengths to see how it varies. And the reason that we're doing this, actually, is because when we measure spectral slopes, this is shown long wave spectral slopes versus longitude in two different latitude bands. So the green points here are at 50 to 60 south latitude versus longitude. And then the black points here are at 50 to 60 north versus longitude. Okay, so what you can see is that there's variation with longitude in these slopes. And what really jumped out at us is, well, for instance, if you look in the south here, you can see that the slopes get dramatically bluer in the South Poican Basin. But they get redder, and they get red in quite a specific region here that we thought that seems to be associated with the Compton-Belkovich area. So let's dig into those and see what it is that might be causing those red slopes in there. And so this is just a map of the north pole of the moon to show how we're going about trying to understand what causes the redness of those slopes. And so we're looking in three different latitude bands here versus longitude over this confined region. So I'll show you blue points here that cover the lowest latitude region here, central over Compton Crater, and then green slopes, and then red slopes. Now the actual Compton-Belkovich thorium anomaly is right here, and so that should be, if there's any effect on the UV slope from that region, we should see it in the green points. So, so here we go. So the red points here again versus longitude at the highest latitude band. Green points here in this mid band, and then blue points here in the lowest latitude band. And so what you see is that over this limited longitude range here, all the slopes are kind of reddish, which is interesting because we know that the moon is mostly blue in the UV. But there is also variation. So there, for instance, if we look in this mid-latitude range here, there's a peak that's centered near that Compton-Belkovich thorium anomaly in redness. But it's much broader than that. So it doesn't seem to be just due to that thorium anomaly. It's much broader than that. And so we can also try to look at a geologic map to say, well, here's that Compton crater, and it has this large ejecta blanket, which is geologically unique. And perhaps that is related to this broad expanse of red slopes. But we think actually that it's even bigger than that. By the way, we have also looked at hydration in this region by looking at spectral slopes over the water absorption edge. And we don't see much variation here. We don't see a variation in slope that could tell us, oh, there's a lot of water in this region here. As a matter of fact, the Compton-Belkovich specific points here are shown in red on top of the blue points. And there's seems to be a range in values here, but they don't seem to be particularly high. So again, the reddish spectral region near Compton-Belkovich we think seems to be more associated with a larger region than just that thorium anomaly or even just the Compton crater. And here's the thorium anomaly, and here's Compton crater in the paper from Jolliffe. So now we look, well, what is it that's causing the reddish UV spectrum? And let's just look at a regular map of the moon from visible wavelengths, and we do see that in this region here, here's Compton crater here, and it is visibly bright. I mean, to me, this looks like a visibly bright region, brighter than other highlands regions. And so that seems to be consistent with the kind of large expanse of reddish UV slopes that we see here. And we also keep in mind that lab spectra, these are from Wagner, of different lunar-like species, indicate that feldspathic materials show a strong increase in brightness, about where we need it to. So this is something that Carl actually talked about yesterday. So perhaps that's playing a role here. So what we think we're seeing here is a widespread region of pretty reddish slopes. It seems to correspond more so than to the thorium anomaly or to Compton crater to just a larger, visibly bright region, which is consistent with feldspathic materials. Now, what's interesting here is that these regions are reddish in the UV, which must have implications for weathering, because we expect the addition of nanophase iron to make a spectrum bluer in the UV. And so perhaps this whole Compton area here is low enough in iron that the effects of weathering are different, both in the UV and in the vis. So just to summarize, the prominent red slope in this region appears to be associated with this visibly bright region. Because we know that the far UV spectrum generally will tend to become bluer with increased weathering, this suggests a different response to weathering in this region here, perhaps because of the inherent soil composition. Perhaps it's a iron poor region, so the response to solar wind weathering is different. I don't know if this region has been studied by others in terms of weathering at visible and near IR wavelengths, and I'd be interested to hear about it if people have studied this region. So next steps for the LAMP dayside analyses are to study images, actually, rather than just looking at slopes of spectra, is to put together images, which we've started working on. These are in the works, and that way maybe we can get even higher resolution and understand smaller regions of variations. And we also are studying swirls, because this has important, the UV can really help out here to understand weathering and photometric implications for the source of these swirls. So that's it. Thank you. Questions, Tim?
Thanks. Tim Glotch, Stony Brook. Compton-Belkovich is one of the spots that we identified with Diviner as being extremely silicic in composition, very low iron content.
Right. Right.
You know, so I think this is consistent with
right.
Your hypothesis that the mineralogy is different and it's weathering differently.
Right, and so I was keeping that in mind, but what I think we're seeing is an even larger region that might be low in iron than just that Compton-Belkovich thorium anomaly region, too. So if that's consistent with Diviner results, too, that's great.
Nice talk, Amanda. Carl Hibbets from APL. So, yeah, to second what Tim is saying, yeah, it looks very consistent with compositional effects. And it's interesting in that perhaps space weathering doesn't affect the UV quite as much at those wavelengths on 170 nanometers. That could be perhaps because those bands are due to oxymetal charge transfer. Possibly nanophase iron doesn't really affect that because you don't actually have it bonded. You don't have the metal bonded with oxygen for charge transfer absorptions to be affected.
So my point was that the UV is very sensitive to weathering in terms of seeing the presence of nanophase iron.
Interesting. Okay.
I don't know if I was addressing
you did say that. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
And so maybe this is such an iron poor region that you don't see the typical lunar-like weathering effects, which I think might be consistent with the brightness, the visible brightness of the region too. One more.
So I don't know how long ago it was, but Paul Lucy had put together this iron map from the Clementine data, And I think, I don't have the photographic memory, but I think, this shows up as particularly iron poor there, but I think that's another place to go look because they actually try to do some, get some quantitative iron abundances from the Clementine data.
Good idea. I should check that and see what the spatial extent of that iron poor region is. Thanks.
And since I have the microphone, I'll put in my 2 cents. We do see what we consider the UV and the WAC, LROC WAC data, 320, 360 nanometers. We see a really strong UV absorption right at Compton Belkovich, but I don't think we've seen much around in the surrounding area.
We've talked about doing some comparisons between LAMP and WAC, LROC WAC, and so that would be a neat area to study.
All right. On to our next